Talk about the lawsuit you've just filed.
Well, this lawsuit, which is by the Center of Justice and Accountability, is a civil lawsuit, but the aim is not to receive pecuniary, because this doesn't help at all. It's to reinforce the extradition petition, which was approved by the Chilean Supreme Court and is now in United States territory. It's somehow to support that and to appeal to public opinion here in the United States. We know there are many people here, on repeated visits here. I have met so many friends who have condemned the coup on the 11th of September 1973, and I appeal to all the people who have listened to Victor's songs, who realize, and for all the victims of Pinochet, that they should support and appeal to your own government to realmente reply positively to this extradition request.
After break, we'll also be joined by your lawyer to talk more about the lawsuit. But describe what happened on September 11th, 1973. Where were you? Where was Victor?
Yeah, well, we were both at home with our two daughters. There was somehow a coup in the air. We had been fearing that there might be a military coup. On that morning, together, Victor and I listened to Allende's last speech and heard all the radios who supported Salvador Allende falling off the air as he one by one and being replaced by military marches. Victor was due to go to the Technical University, his place of work, where Allende was due to speak to announce a plebiscite at 11 o'clock. And Victor was to sing there, as he did. And he went out that morning. It was the last time I saw him. I stayed at home, heard of the bombing of the Moneda Palace, heard and saw the helicopters, machine gun firing over Allende's residence. And then began the long wait for Victor to come back home.
And how long did you wait?
I waited a week, not knowing really what had happened to him. I got a message from him, from somebody who'd been in the stadium with him. Wasn't sure what was really happening to him. But my fears were confirmed on the 11th of September, on the 18th of September, Chile National Day, when a young man came to my house, said, "Please, I need to talk to you. I'm a friend. I've been working in the city morgue, and I'm afraid to tell you that Victor's body has been recognized because it was his was a well-known face." And he said, "You must come with me and claim his body, otherwise they will put him in a common grave and he will disappear." So then I accompanied this young man to the city morgue. We entered by a side entrance. I saw the hundreds of bodies, literally hundreds of bodies that were piled up in what was actually the parking place, I think, of the morgue. And I had to look for Victor's body among a long line in the offices of the city morgue. Recognized him. I saw what had happened to him. I saw the bullet wounds. I saw the state of his body. And I consider myself one of the lucky ones in the sense that I had to face at that moment that what had happened to Victor, and I could give my testimony with all the force of what I felt in that moment, and not that horror, which is much worse, of never knowing what happened to your loved one, as happened to so many families, so many women who have spent these 40 years looking for their loved ones who were made to disappear.
Because he was so well known, there have been many stories about his death. Some said because he was this famous folk singer, guitarist, his hands were cut off. Others said they were smashed. How did you see? What did you see when you saw his body?
This is not true. There was this invention of myths that people, I suppose, thought would help. The truth was bad enough. There was no need to invent more horrors. Victor's hands were not cut off. When I saw his body, his hands were hanging at a strange angle. His whole body was bruised and battered and with bullet wounds. But I didn't touch his hands. It looked as though his wrists were broken.
How long had Victor played guitar? How long had he been singing?
How long he'd been singing? Since he was small, he didn't really learn to play the guitar until he was adolescent, but his mother was a folk singer and he learned from her, yeah.
And how did you meet?
We met because in the University of Chile, Victor was a student in the theatre school. I was a dancer in the National Ballet, but I also gave classes in the theatre school. That's how I met him. He was an excellent student. He was at least the best of his course. But we actually got together later, when I was recovering from when I was sort of ill, and he heard I was ill. He came to see me with a little bunch of flowers that I think he took out to the park because he was penniless.
And you had 2 daughters together?
No, not together. My first daughter is actually the daughter of my first husband, whom I had separated from, but she was very, very small when Victor came to see us that day. He was only a year old, slightly less than a year old. And she always felt that Victor was her father, and Victor always felt that she was her daughter. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking English. So they were very, very close.
And the hundreds of bodies you saw in this morgue, how many of them were identified?
Can't tell you that. This particular young man who worked in the identification civil registry, I don't know what you call it, he was overwhelmed with what he had to do. I can't tell you.
Were you able to claim his body and bury him?
I was one of the lucky ones. I was able to claim his body, but we had to take it immediately to the cemetery and inter it in a niche high up in the back wall of the cemetery. There could be no funeral, and after that I had to go home and tell my daughters what had happened.
Describe this lawsuit, the legal grounds on which you bring this 40 years after Victor Jara was killed.
Absolutely. These lawsuits are happening in the United States, and there's an important number of them. They are civil by nature because it's a torts, which is it's a legal word, but I mean it's what they really look for is a reward on damages. But really, the nature of the evidence and the relevance of the documents and everything that goes into the case really doesn't distinguish in my mind between criminal and civil. It's under 2 federal statutes in the United States called the Alien Tort Statute from 1789, ironically, first Congress, and the Torture Victims Protection Act, which is later on in 1992. And what they provide for is the right to victims, whether they're aliens under the ATS or also U.S. citizens under the TVPA, or what we call it, the TVPA, to bring suit for human rights violations. The second statute provides for torture and extrajudicial killing specifically, and the Alien Torts Statute allows you to bring in a more open or wide number of claims, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and slavery. Many claims over the years. Colleagues and friends have brought suit under these laws. And I guess the jurisdictional basis, not to be over technical, but one of the more solid ones has been the physical presence of the defendant in the United States, which is what I will say the Center for Justice and Accountability specialized other colleagues at the Center for Constitutional Rights and other institutions have more experience with corporate cases and so forth. And in this particular instance, Pedro Pablo Barrientos, the guy who has been investigated and identified by Chilean prosecutors and judges as the author through testimony of Víctor Jara's assassination, has been living for a number of years, for almost 20 years, in Florida, of all places.
How did you find this out?
We actually came to the attention of Chile television first, and they did a big program about both the investigation in Chile and the likelihood of this person. It was an interesting step, the likelihood of this person being the Barrientos that was named in the pleadings in Chile. And after the program, the judge ordered a couple of extra, steps from a criminal investigation standpoint, and they were able to identify him. And I was contacted by the prosecutors in Chile, with whom we have a relationship from prior work, to see if we can actually corroborate one more, step to see if he was the person. And he is the same officer that left Chile, we believe, between 1989 and 1990 and relocated in Deltona.
Do you believe the U.S. knew
that he was
who he was?
I'm not sure he was high enough, to be frank, from all the information that we have right now.
Because he was granted U.S. citizenship.
He was granted U.S. citizenship, and what I don't necessarily know that at the time that he was probably requesting or filed his naturalization application, that the U.S. will know his involvement. And I think that these guys specialize in lying in those applications, in my experience. So there's no way necessarily for the U.S. to know. Although I do believe that overall the U.S. looked somewhere else when all these people were coming from Latin America in the aftermath of their conflicts, no question, particularly military men.
This Alien Tort Claims Act, which we have covered many times in the past, you yourself have used in other cases. Very briefly, if you could talk about the Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero.
That's right. It was an important case at a personal and professional level. It was filed in 2003, and also with a little bit of this twisted thing of faith. A guy who was crucial to the assassination had been identified by the Truth Commission, by U.S. important declassified documents and other sources, as the driver, as the sort of right-hand man of Roberto Dabuison, who conceived the assassination and sort of the whole plot. And he was the guy who drove the shooter to the church, and he was living in Modesto, California, running an auto shop. And after we were able to establish that truthfully and corroborate it, we filed suit, which was a very important suit. I will say is the only time in the history of the crime for the conditions of El Salvador where any justice has been provided for this emblematic killing. And it was the first case. He
was killed March 24th, 1980. The Archbishop of El Salvador.
While celebrating Mass, absolutely. And it was kind of marks in the history and the imaginary of Salvadorans, marks the beginning of their 10-year civil war. It really was a declaration of war in the old-fashioned sense. It was against all civilians and against the pueblo that he defended so much. It was a provocative statement killing the Archbishop, who had been in his homilies and publicly condemning the actions of the army against the people of El Salvador.
Joan Jara, how did you figure out that who was responsible for the killing of Victor, your husband?
I didn't figure it out because the Chilean army would not give the information who of the officers who were responsible for the Chile Stadium where Victor was killed. But gradually, within the proceedings of the case, officers were named, especially by the conscripts, under whose orders they were, yeah. And it's these people these soldiers of lesser ranks who have identified the officers who were responsible for the crimes.
That's a very important point. Sorry, there's been no desire or willingness on behalf of the armed forces in Chile to collaborate with the families and the victims struggling for 40 years. They have to rely, the investigators, in now testimony from these low-level soldiers who don't have that kind of pact of silence, and they're providing information that is crucial for their work.
Well, I may say that they have had to have a pact of silence during many decades because they have been threatened by the armed forces. They should not speak, and there have been many who have been very scared to give their testimony until now.